and we can let people start filtering in. Vicky, I'm going to demote you. I don't know how to demote you now that it started. Change role to attendee. There we go. Okay. And it's filling up. Excellent. So it looks like we have all of our authors are here, right? Everybody who's supposed to be presenting is here.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So for everybody coming in, this is the 11 a.m. Eastern time session on human trafficking. We're going to go in the order of the program. Every one of you will have 10 minutes. I will interject with a 1-minute warning. For Q&A, we'll save Q&A for the end. If anybody in attendance has any questions, please post them in the Q&A forum and not the chat. I would prefer to keep the chat kind of quiet if that's all right with everybody. So post them in the Q&A box and we will address those at the end as time allows. So I guess without any further ado, we will start with our first paper, Human Trafficking and Forced Marriage.
Hello.
Whenever you're ready.
Thank you for attending this session. I'm going to, I'll try to share the presentation with you. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Then my name is Nuria Torres, and I am a criminal law associate professor in Universitat Rovira Virgili, and I will present the main results of our research that we have conducted with my colleague Carolina Villacampa from University of Lleida. The topic of our research is the link between human trafficking and forced marriages. Although forced marriages performed in Western countries have been mostly linked to family issues and therefore as a sort of domestic violence or even as traditional practices, there are several reports have stressed the link between forced marriages and trafficking human beings. So in this context, in case a young woman or a girl was forced to marry someone she did not want to, what would be the response from the authorities in Spain? Would it be considered as a form of human trafficking? From the criminal law perspective and regarding consequences in terms of prosecution, the difference is important in Spain, since as you can see, if a forced marriage is classified as a coercion offense, it can be punished with a prison sentence of up to 2 years or with a fine, while if considered trafficking, it could mean a prison sentence of up to 8 years and even up to 12 years if the victim is underage. So the classification of the offense has therefore important implications in terms of punishment, but also in terms of victim protection. Therefore, the question that we asked ourselves was, are there cases of forced marriage linked to trafficking human beings in Western countries and particularly in our country? And how do professionals recognize such cases? And which implications does this have for professionals and for victims? To explore these research questions and to learn more on the phenomenon of forced marriages, we developed an empirical research. We conducted in-depth interviews with professionals working both in criminal justice system and in victim support. And the final sample included 34 professionals, of which 14 worked in criminal justice and 20 in victim assistance. Questions were designed to explore, among other things, how victims of forced marriages were detected by professionals, what were the dynamics of victimization, that's to know how were victims compelled to marry, which effects professionals detected on victims, and finally, what professionals thought victims would expect from professional intervention. The main results of this research are the following. Regarding detection of victims, we realized that normally victims at risk were directly dealt by victim support professionals, while criminal justice professionals would only intervene in more severe cases, when they were required to deploy a protective operation to save or to protect the victim. Secondly, regarding the dynamics of victimization, professionals in victim support highlighted the involvement of the family, and they mainly described cases in which parents or close relatives followed the traditions of the community to which they were attached, mainly to maintain the cultural identity after a migration process. Sometimes forced marriages was also a tool to deal with young women considered to observe excessively Western lifestyle. Consequently, people chosen for the marriage were normally close relatives or people coming from the same community as the family. In such cases, the mechanism to force the young women to engage and to marry was family pressure, which sometimes included severe intimidation and even the deprivation of liberty of girls who refused. In contrast to that, professionals in criminal justice did establish a close relationship between forced marriages and trafficking. In fact, 11 out of the 14 interviewees described cases in which the three elements of the trafficking process, as described in the United Nations Protocol, could be observed. Such cases involved generally young women sold as brides. This was mainly the case of Roma girls who lived in Romania and who had been sold by their parents to someone of their own community. So after the sale, the girl was moved into Spain. In very few cases, the girl seemed to be married to a Spaniard. This was, for example, the case of a girl from Nepal who was sold by her relative to a Spaniard, who then brought her to Spain, where she became a sexual and a domestic slave. In all cases, the victim was treated as a property for which a price had been paid. In addition to those, two other interviewees referred to other cases which appear to have a strong link with trafficking. Firstly, women who married while they were in transit towards Spain during a process of illegal smuggling or already as victims of a trafficking process. In these cases, the women would try to avoid being sexually forced by other men during the journey. So the marriage would become a mechanism to reduce more harmful effects during the journey. Secondly, women who run away from their families in their country mostly in their countries of origin, once they had learned of the plans to get them married. So fleeing their home and abandoning their family turned them into a situation of vulnerability that made them easily accessible to trafficking networks. So the plans for the marriage were the origin of a further trafficking process. On the effects on victims, interviewees considered that they were serious, both when those at risk were finally compelled to marry, as well as when women managed to escape the situation. In the first case, they would suffer of physical and sexual abuse, stress, and loss of confidence. However, those who decided to flee, they were faced with breaking family ties, feelings of guilt, loneliness, and the rejection of the family. Finally, regarding what professionals thought that victims would expect from them, they considered that victims would need help, being listened, and feeling that they were not alone. Many of the interviewees, both from victim support and from criminal justice, considered that recurring to the criminal justice system would not really help the victims, since most of them didn't want to initiate criminal proceedings against their parents or relatives. And in fact, professionals in victim support mentioned that most girls wish to remain linked with their families. So to conclude, we have found evidence that cases of forced marriage do exist in Western countries in which the victim is sold as a merchandise, she has no options to refuse the marriage, and she suffers intimidation, isolation, and domestic or sexual exploitation. However, most cases detected are still linked to certain family traditions and as mechanism to maintain links with community members after a migration process. And generally, they are not considered as cases for trafficking. What we have observed in our research is that when professionals belong to criminal justice, particularly prosecutors and some police officers, it's possible that they consider prosecuting as trafficking. Contrarily, when professionals belong to victim support field, the intervention will prioritize mediating with the family and accompanying the victim. However, such differences are not in the interest of the victim protection. Therefore, it seems important to create structures that enable cooperation between professionals in different fields in order to properly assess the existing risk and to respond accordingly. This means offering all victims the existing protection measures for victims of trafficking, or at least with the protection measures for victims of gender-based violence, particularly in terms of housing, personal protection, and legal and economic aid. That was all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our next paper, excuse me, is Perspectives on Human Trafficking for Criminal Exploitation. Whenever you're ready. Nuria, there you go.
Yeah.
Let me just pull up my presentation. Okay, can everyone see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in Spain or a different time zone. My name is Ruiz, and I'm currently pursuing my PhD at the University of Lleida. My area of study is human trafficking, and today I will be presenting on the topic of human trafficking for criminal exploitation, specifically the results of a study, a qualitative study that was conducted in Spain. There are two wonderful co-authors to this presentation, which are Carolina Villacampa, also from the University of Lleida, and Nuria Torres from the University of Rovira in Spain. So human trafficking is a complex phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon, and it's basically a plight with many victims exploited all over the world. According to the United Nations, every country in the world is affected by human trafficking, whether as a country of origin, transit, or destination of victims. So what is human trafficking for criminal exploitation? Generally speaking, human trafficking has an act, a means, and a purpose. So when we're focusing on the act, we're looking at what is being done, whether it's recruitment, transport, harboring, receipt of persons. When we're looking at the means, we're looking at how it's being done. So whether by use of threat, use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability, or payments or benefits. Now, when we're looking at the purpose, we're looking at some form of exploitation. So it could be sexual exploitation, and it could also be forced marriages, which we just previously heard. It could be removal of organs. And for our purposes today, the exploitation is to force someone to commit crimes. So again, criminal exploitation as a purpose. We have the acts plus the means plus the purpose of forcing someone to commit an illegal or anti-regulatory activity. So there are four main categories of these crimes: property crimes, drug crimes, violent crimes, and other. So under property crimes, we're looking at ATM theft, shoplifting, pickpocketing. Under drug crimes, we're looking at cannabis cultivation or drug trafficking or smuggling. An example of this would be drug mules. Under violent crimes, we're looking at terrorism and even murder. And under the other category, we're looking at benefits fraud, illegal adoption, sham marriages, counterfeit goods production, among others. So human trafficking for criminal exploitation is among the lesser known forms of human trafficking. The graph reflects forms of exploitation among detected victims in 2011. As we can see, 53% was for sexual exploitation, 40% was for labor exploitation, 3% was for organ removal, and 7% was for other. Now, under this other category is where we would find criminal exploitation. It is lumped together in this other category, and so we don't even really know what the exact numbers are. So between 2011 and 2014, a qualitative research study was undertaken in Spain, and it involved victims and professionals, two types of professionals: victim assistance professionals and criminal justice system professionals. The goals of the study were, on the one hand, to understand why victims of human trafficking for criminal exploitation are not being identified, and on the other hand, to understand the effects suffered by the victims due to this lack of identification. So the study with victims, it was conducted by interviews that took place anywhere between 30 to 90 minutes, and the sample consisted of 45 imprisoned women in Spain. 18 were European, 22 were Latin American, and 3 were African. The results of the study with victims demonstrated that only 10 out of the 45 women interviewed were classified as victims of human trafficking for criminal exploitation. 7 were Latin American, 2 European, and 1 Asian. And it also demonstrated that interactions with authorities were limited to the purpose of identifying further offenses of crimes. In only 1 case did a prison officer show any interest behind the reasons as to why the woman was committing the crime. The study with professionals was also conducted via interviews that took place anywhere between 30 to 90 minutes. And the sample was, again, victim assistance professionals and criminal justice system professionals. The victim assistance professionals included NGO and organizations that provide assistance to victims. And the criminal justice system professionals included lawyers, prosecutors, judges, and prison officers. So the results of the study demonstrated varying degrees of awareness of the concept of human trafficking for criminal exploitation. Victim assistance professionals were more conscious of this reality, while criminal justice system professionals were generally unaware. So the conclusions of the study were that the study with professionals demonstrated that professionals, were not identifying or detecting the victims. And it also demonstrated that professionals are more focused on human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and that they are more influenced by the stereotype of an ideal victim. And the study with victims confirmed that human trafficking for criminal exploitation is in fact a reality in Spain. So we have some recommendations here, which are generally training, identification, and the principle of non-punishment. So professionals should undergo more training in order to have a more global knowledge of human trafficking for criminal exploitation. In terms of identification of victims, it shouldn't be limited to specialized police as it is in Spain. And professionals should be made aware of the principle of non-punishment, which is a more human rights, victim-centered approach to human trafficking. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. 6.5 minutes. Well done. I appreciate that. I also just want to take a second to say there are currently 63 people in attendance, which is more than I've had in total of 15 years of going to present at in-person conferences. So thank you, everybody, for turning up today. And our next paper is ready to go, Human Trafficking in Spain, Dimensions and Characteristics, whenever you're ready. You're muted. Oh, you're still muted. Oh.
Now I have to share my presentation again.
No problem.
Wow. Oh, sorry. This is becoming difficult for me now at this moment.
That's okay.
Problem is that I need to here perhaps. Okay. Now you can see it's okay, and
Yep.
you can hear me. Okay. So,
Yep.
well, sorry for the delay. Good morning, good afternoon for those in Europe. My name is Villacampa, and I'm presenting on behalf of the 3 researchers from the University of Lleida involved in this research. Glad that the CRIMCON organization accepted the abstract we submitted, because this gives us the opportunity to present some data from quantitative research on human trafficking victims in Spain we completed this spring. It was carried out within the framework of a project funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science, whose main objective was to formulate a proposal for a comprehensive Spanish law against human trafficking, after having conducted empirical analysis on this reality. Well, it said that human trafficking constitutes a phenomenon that victimizes massively disposable people. However, the amount of those victimized worldwide is still unknown. As the literature indicates, having reliable quantitative data on it is very complex. In addition to the scarcity of existing data, that obtained is too focused on sex trafficking, paying little attention to other forms of it, as other previous presentations have shown. In Spain, the agency that quantifies these victims and transfers the information to the EU to compile the statistics that the European Commission has published so far is the Center for Intelligence on Terrorism and Organized Crime, the CITCO. However, CITCO is also very focused on sex trafficking and gathers only few data of victims formally identified by the police. In view of the virtual absence of quantitative data on human trafficking in Spain, in 2019, we decided to undertake an investigation to quantify the victims detected by all the professionals who might have come into contact with them during the 2 years preceding the investigation, that is 2017 and 2018, with the specific objectives indicated on this slide. To do that, database containing more than 700 professionals that may have come into contact with human trafficking victims was developed. They were online surveyed, and we got 150 responses to this questionnaire. After data processing, we obtained information on victimization by trafficking for sexual, labor, criminal, and other forms of exploitation, mostly forced marriages, but also organ or blood donation that I will present here. Moving on to the findings of this research presented with reference to the objectives that made it up, the first aim was to quantify the number of victims detected in Spain in the 2 years period, research period, which amounts to 7,448. Almost 96% of those were classified according to their gender, age, and the type of trafficking experienced, while 4% were not. The number of detected victims in this research is much more higher than those formally identified in the same 2 years period by the Spanish police, which amounts to 458, according to the CITCO. It's closer to the number of registered victims in other European countries that are more effective than Spain when it comes to detect trafficking victims, because they allow other professionals beyond the police to register victims, like the UK that detected 7,000 victims in the same period, or the Netherlands detecting 2,500 in this 2 years period. The comparison between these two figures, detected victims versus identified victims by the police, confirms that victims formally identified by the Spanish police may only be the tip of the iceberg. The second aim of the research was to determine the socio-demographic characteristics of the victims according to the form of exploitation suffered. The personal characteristics of the more than 7,000 classified victims can be observed in the table on the screen. Most of them have been victims of sex trafficking, 92% of them, compared to those of labor trafficking and other forms of exploitation. These results are representative of the institutional approximation to human trafficking in Spain, which is very focused on sex trafficking, even more than in other European countries, where on average 60% of victims are for sex trafficking. The number of women is clearly prevalent in the case compared with labor trafficking, but even in the latter one, the number of women is relevant, probably because it includes the measurement of domestic slavery, which almost affects women. By crossing victims' socio-demographic variables or characteristics with the type of trafficking they experience, we found that sex is an explanatory variable of the type of trafficking suffered, and it's stated by the literature, showing that women tend to be victims of sex trafficking while men tend to suffer labor trafficking. This finding was also confirmed by this research, since the probability of victimization of adult men by labor trafficking increases by 1.2 compared with sex trafficking. Less relevant was the age of victims to explain the type of trafficking they went through. Also, the victim's nationality has proved to be a relevant variable to explain the type of trafficking experience. Victims of labor trafficking come mostly from Asia and Africa, mainly Maghreb, but is not confirmed by the CITCO data. Victims of sex trafficking come largely from South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Eastern Europe. Most victims of human trafficking for criminal exploitation come from Eastern Europe. Those of other forms of exploitation, mostly forced marriage, are either African or Eastern European. The third aim of the research was to establish the commissive dynamics by type of trafficking. For each type of trafficking, we asked where victims were recruited and where they were sent, the mechanisms used to recruit them, and the means used to traffic them. As for the place of victims' recruitment, as you can see in the graphic, this usually coincides with the place of origin. So the recruitment of victims usually takes place in the countries of origin, which contradicts the latest data from the European Commission, indicating that a relevant number of victims are recruited in Europe. The place of destination of the detected victims is largely Spain, followed by other European countries, confirming that Western European countries are destination areas. The type of human trafficking we're dealing with is relevant in explaining the mechanisms used to recruit victims as well. Being the oral form of recruitment by relatives, friends, or acquaintances, the most relevant in all forms of trafficking, the internet is a recruitment mechanism used in human trafficking for sex and criminal exploitation, not for labor, while placement and temporary employment agencies are a form of recruitment used mostly in labor trafficking, followed by sex trafficking. In fact, victims of labor trafficking are 200 times more likely to be recruited through an employment agency than sex trafficking victims. Finally, as for commissive dynamics, with respect to the means used, it can be seen how the abuse of power by traffickers and of a situation of vulnerability of the victim is much more prevalent in sex than in any other type of trafficking. Thus, sex trafficking can be described as an abusive one. Labor trafficking is much more likely to involve fraud or deception, becoming with this fraudulent type of trafficking. In human trafficking for criminal exploitation, fraud and deception and even threat are more widely used means than abuse of power. And human trafficking for other forms of exploitation recurs to threat or coercion is considered as prevalent as abuse of power. These two later types are consequently the most coercive ones. The fourth aim of the research was to recognize how, in which activities, the victims are exploited. In sex trafficking, the victims detected are mostly exploited for prostitution in clubs, followed by street prostitution and exploitation in strip clubs and bars. Paradoxically, few victims are detected in the pornography industry, about 2%, although it's considered to constitute a growing form of sexual exploitation. As for victims of labor trafficking, they are predominantly exploited in farming or cattle industry and domestic service, followed far behind by exploitation in the building sector, the textile industry, and in catering and shops or retail. These results are not consistent with previous qualitative studies conducted in Spain, the one Sayury has presented, which hardly gave any importance to the agricultural sector in this matter. Finally, victims of human trafficking for criminal exploitation detected are usually recruited for street property crime and forced begging. To a lesser extent, they were compelled to engage in behaviors related to drug trafficking, either production and cultivation or being used as drug couriers as mule, contrary to what previous qualitative studies carried out in Spain had suggested. And sorry, this was the study that Sayury has presented previously, not the previous one. So, to conclude, much still needs to be done in Spain and also in other European countries in terms of collecting statistical data to improve the quantitative knowledge we have on human trafficking. Data collection must be more systematic, complete, and comparable to become really meaningful. However, from the information obtained in this research, some conclusions can be deduced in order to approach this reality from a victim-centered perspective in my country to observe what the international regulations to fight human trafficking require. Basically the Council of Europe Basel Convention. So firstly, it's necessary to increase the effectiveness in victim identification to bring the number of identified victims closer to those detected. In order to do so, a more flexible identification system, not only based in police identification, as Lady Sayury has already said, should be implemented. Secondly, the differences detected through this research in victim profiles, commission dynamics, and exploitation activities, depending on the type of trafficking we are dealing with, should be taken into account, not only to further deepen our knowledge on each of these types, but also to design appropriate prevention and intervention programs specifically designed for each of them. And well, that's all. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you. Our last paper this morning is the Care of Victims of Human Trafficking, a comparative analysis through the existing protocols in the European context. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I suppose that you can see the slide, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so good morning, everyone, those in US, and good afternoon, those in Europe and Spain. My name is Xavier Miranda, and I am postdoctoral researcher in the field of social work at the University of Lleida in Spain. And what I'm going to introduce you now is a presentation made jointly with Professor Carolina Villacampa, also from the University of Lleida. And our aim in this research has been to compare the existing protocols for victims of trafficking in the European context, and also gaining a deeper understanding of these tools, as well as their level of implementation. For this purpose, 6 countries were selected: the Netherlands, Portugal, United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, and Germany. And to put this notion of protocols into context, it can be said that there are 4 basic aspects in relation to these instruments. Firstly, they should articulate a cooperative framework for action between public and civil society actors involved in this phenomenon. Secondly, they should organize the detection and identification of victims and refer them to the corresponding services and resources. Thirdly, protocols should describe the mechanisms and actions to be taken in order to protect and to promote the human rights of victims. And finally, they should establish the mechanisms to monitor and assess the impact of the actions on the victims. Regarding the method, the research question you can see on the slide has given the orientation to our work. Thus, we have focused on identifying the measures and processes which are most significant to achieve a victim-centered approach. And for that, an in-depth review of the content of 29 official documents and websites on this subject has been carried out. And in addition, 6 external monitoring reports were also selected. The analysis has been organized into 5 key areas: identification of victims, provision of assistance, protection of the victim in the context of criminal proceedings, protection measures focused on immigrants, and finally, the mechanisms for accessing the right to compensation. Well, in line with the above, the results are organized in these 5 areas. In each one of these, we have selected a country which provides a measure or procedure or a set of them that, in our view, represents a good practice in order to move closer to the victim-centered approach. First of all, I'm going to talk about identification. This is a key step in any strategy designed to address this issue. If it doesn't work effectively, then the access to rights, as well as the access to adequate standards of protection, are unaffordable for victims. The table in the slide includes the victim register by the 6 countries and includes also the yearly rate per million inhabitants. While the Netherlands has the highest rate, I would like to highlight the existing tool in the UK, because this is a mechanism that includes the multi-agent and multi-sectorial criteria required in protocols in order to build strong cooperation structures. This tool is the national referral mechanism, which establishes 3 stages for identification. The first stage involves the detection and referral of potential victims by first responders through the referral form. The second stage involves the consideration of the merits of the case by an official to determine whether a person might have been a victim of trafficking. Finally, in the third stage, a conclusive decision by the competent authority is taken. A relevant aspect about this tool is that it is very structured process with a good level of detail in the collection of information. In the same way, it should be noted the importance of the first responders, which includes government agencies, local authorities, and NGOs, since they are key players in the detection and referral. I turn to assistance, where in this case, 2 countries have been selected, the Netherlands and Portugal. While both countries have good standards in the provision of service to victims, what really stands out in them, comparing to the other countries, is their ability to organize the provision of assistance in a coordinated and organized manner, and also with a good capacity to monitor the intervention that is carried out with the victims. In the Dutch case, it is done by the setting up of two operational levels, one regional and another national. In contrast, in the Portuguese case, it is carried out through 5 specialized multidisciplinary teams, which facilitate and monitor the intervention in each one of the 5 territorial distributions of the country. The first section concerns the protection of victims during criminal proceedings. An important issue to point out in this area is the right of victims to have access to a recovery and reflection period, which can be used for the victim to consider cooperating with authorities during the investigation of the trafficking crime. During this period, victims cannot be removed from the country. The minimum time set by the convention is 30 days, although, as you can see on the slide, countries such as the Netherlands, Spain, and Germany extended to 90 days. Also in the table, you can see the rate of reflection periods granted during 2015 and 2016. In this section, we want to highlight the program for victims and witnesses of the Netherlands, since it is one that goes more deeply into an appropriate protection for victims' cooperation with the criminal investigation. In addition to the existence of specialized shelters, there is a wide range of protection measures during court proceedings. Regarding protection measures on immigrants, it is well known that ensuring legal residency in the countries of destination is one of the most important elements to achieve victims' recovery. In the table, you can see the number of non-EU victims in each country and the rate of residence permits granted. Despite the fact that Spain has some weaknesses in this area, especially with regard to the application for international protection, we underline the Spanish case as it gets significant data regarding the rate of resident permits granted. In that way, the number of residence permits issued by Spain on the basis of personal situation has progressively increased in recent years. In fact, to grant such permits, the competent administration has worked in coordination with NGOs, which have substantial information about the victims' process. Finally, in the last section, we have focused on the mechanisms of economic compensation for the damages caused by traffickers to victims. Continuing with this comparative analysis, we highlight again the case of the Netherlands as the country that has made greater progress in this area. Of all the aspects you can see on the slide, I will mention the last two, the State Compensation Fund and the Violent Offences Compensation Fund. Regarding the first one, it includes the anticipation of the payment of compensation in cases in which the traffickers do not comply with the execution of the sentence within a reasonable period of time. And concerning the second one, this is used when the victim's case took place in the Netherlands and the person didn't receive compensation in any other way. Well, to conclude, I shall end pointing out that we have found significant differences between the structures and instruments used by the 6 countries selected. In this regard, the Netherlands, Portugal, and the United Kingdom are the countries that offer a more comprehensive response to the complexity of this phenomenon, and they have also made more progress towards the victim-centered approach comparing to the other 3. In particular, we highlight the Netherlands because in addition to what have been said, is the only country among those analyzed that has an external agent, I mean independent of the government, that evaluates and monitors the public action in this field. This agent is the National Rapporteur. Concerning Spain, there is a relevant network of NGOs whose contribution is very significant, especially with regard to assistance of victims. This is also the same for Germany. However, in the Spanish case, there is a poor multi-agency approach in the identification of victims, and this is an important point to overcome. With reference to Germany and Italy, both have some problems in their structures for the care of victims. Germany, for example, despite the fact that there are cooperation agreements between public and civil society actors in 13 out of 16 German federal states, there is an absence of a national agreement to define countrywide standards. And in the case of Italy, despite the existence of a national protocol, there is evidence of its poor penetration and practical implementation throughout the territory. That was all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Fantastic work, everybody. So if anybody in attendance has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. A couple have been addressed already, so please feel free to read through those. I don't want to waste people's time by reading stuff that's already been answered by our panelists. So one question that is outstanding, and Haley, I think this is probably for the panel. What was your biggest and or scariest realization you found in your research on human trafficking? Anybody who wants to address that question, please feel free to do so.
Sorry, Andy, it might be because of my low level of English, but I don't understand exactly what means realization when it comes to the research we carry out on trafficking.
I guess, like, what was something that you found during the course of your research that that surprised you?
Perhaps the most surprising thing, this is my opinion. I'm not very. We have presented 4 different empirical researches here, so, and I've been involved in more or less in all of them. I would say that perhaps the most shocking realization for me was when we conducted the research on human trafficking for criminal exploitation, finding Nuria is nodding as well, finding women who had been had passed through the Spanish criminal justice system as offenders, while they were in fact in reality undetected victims of human trafficking. And not only this was very shocking for me because this was Spain, because I feared that in fact a similar situation to this might be happening with men imprisoned in Spain, and also men imprisoned in many other Western European countries, and also perhaps, why not, in the USA. I mean, because the lens through which we look at offenders is always the lens of offender. We have a very stereotype concept of human trafficking victims, which is very normally linked with women, immigrant women, sexually exploited, and our systems are very ready to detect this type of victims, but they are not ready to detect other type of victims. So I think that I can say that the most shocking realization for me was this. As for the quantitative study I have presented here, it was only confirming what we feared, that the Spanish system was very linked to identify victims of human trafficking for sexual exploitation. So this meant not a big surprise. And well, I don't know, perhaps in the case of forced marriage, Nuria, I don't know if you share my opinion, but perhaps the most shocking thing is that we realized, in fact, that most of the cases of forced marriage that we identified were in fact cases of that were like family linked cases of forced marriage, which were not forced in a very strong way. They were leads. The women were leads to a forced marriage more than pushed into situations of forced marriage. I don't know if you share my my view in this regard.
Yeah, of course, I completely share your opinion in this case, Carolina. On the one hand, the women that we found in prison who had been convicted for committing a crime that was the question was scaring, no? Biggest and scariest realization. I think when we went out from prison, we were somehow scared of finding those women there, and who were serving very long prison penalties for, in most cases, for drug trafficking. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they had been obliged or they had been forced to do that. And regarding forced marriages, I think that it was also important for us to realize that professionals were aware that this was a reality in our country, so that it is happening in Western societies, in Europe, and it is also happening in the USA. But somehow professionals didn't really know how to how to perform in front of these cases, because in the one hand, they wanted the girl or the young women to keep contact and to be attached to the family. But on the other hand, they were also aware that these young women were suffering. And it is a very difficult position for teachers who discover that any of their pupils or their students is in that situation. But it was also difficult for social assistants and also for police who didn't really know what to do in those cases. So this multi-agency cooperation is still missing at least in our country.
And I would like to ask as well at what Nuria has said, that perhaps professionals did not know exactly how to deal with these cases, perhaps because our system was giving them a very straight answer, in terms that the only answer they found was criminal. I mean, there was no other, there were no other protection measure that they could research to in order to give a legal solution to these cases.
Okay, thank you. A question just came in for you, Lottie. They write, what do you think is the most important policy which should be implemented in order to determine when a person has been a victim of criminal exploitation? And can you elaborate on what would be the best ways to carry out such a policy?
Okay. I believe, in my humble opinion, I mean, it's early days in my research coming into this field. I think that the policy should be more centered on a more victim-centered approach, looking into more of a non-punishment principle. So first, I think that we would need to perhaps identify what types of crimes could be committed by these types of victims. So for example, drug mules, right? And then focus specifically on the victim in order to understand, what led them. There should be more interest in that, as opposed to just a punitive approach, which is, let's get the bad guys. We don't really, care what's going on with the victim. So I think that just overall, a more victim-centered approach would be my humble opinion.
May I add something, Andy? If we have time.
Absolutely.
Well, in fact, human trafficking for criminal exploitation is a type of trafficking that can be considered part of human trafficking for labor exploitation. I'm saying this because I know that the Palermo Protocol does not contain a specific reference to the human trafficking for criminal exploitation, which means that mostly the elements of this type of trafficking are exactly the same that the elements in any other type of trafficking. That is, action, the process of enslaving someone, from recruitment to transporting this person to the destination country. Second question, means used to recruit this person and to transport and to exploit this person. Coercive means, abusive means, and deception mostly. And finally, the idea of exploitation. Normally, these people are used in the exploitation in their exploitation in criminal activities, which mean any gain, economic gain, of course, for traffickers. So in the case of Europe, we have this type of trafficking more normalized because it was specifically recognized as a type of trafficking in the directive to fight against trafficking in 2011. And it was also referred in the Basel Convention of the Council of Europe. But in fact, is a type of trafficking that can be perfectly fit into the concept of labor trafficking and in the wide concept of force services included into the concept of labor trafficking. So the elements are exactly the same that in other type of trafficking, I'm afraid.
Thank you. So with no more questions, we will end it there. Thank you again to everybody presenting. Outstanding work. Thank you for everybody in attendance for coming out this morning. And hey, if you are planning on staying on this stream to attend the next panel on victimization, for recording purposes, I have to shut down the webinar and I will restart it in about 10 minutes or so. So hopefully I'll see a lot of you there. Thank you again, everybody who presented today.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming to CrimCon. And I will see you around.
All right.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.